Hello, everyone. Today I'm honored to be speaking with Dr. Gabriel Rosenfeld about a wonderful book that he published with Cambridge University Press. The book is called Fascism in America, Past and Present, and it was published in 2023.
Good to be with you.
Um, Fascism in America, it's a very timely topic, and it's a term that has gained more currency these days. I think it kind of started with the rise of this phenomenon called Trumpism, but nowadays we even use it more, even in relation to Europe. And I know it's very difficult to get a definition of the term, but I'm gonna ask you anyway, and I'm sure historians hate when they ask this question to come up with a clear-cut definition of fascism. But can you tell us how you use the term, what the term fascism means in the scope of your research?
Sure. When I teach my undergrads at the university level, I always begin by explaining that fascism has to be understood historically. And so it does emerge out of a very specific historical context in Europe after 1918. Of course, there were precedents for fascism in the 19th century and perhaps even earlier. And of course, there were subsequent movements that resemble fascism that ended after 1945, which is merely just a complicated way of saying there's always been a right wing of the political spectrum. But prior to 1918, there was nothing on the right wing of the European or Western political spectrum called fascism. Of course, that begs the question of, well, what existed there? The fact of the matter is um, right wing thinking more or less had traditionally in Europe always been associated with the conservative aristocracy and monarchy and sort of hereditary rule as it had existed since the Middle Ages. And we, of course, know that when the French Revolution destroyed monarchy really for the first time, if you want to just sort of bracket off England for a quick second, that created a precedent for conservatives becoming reactionaries and wanting to make sure that they could rebuild or restore that old order, that ancien regime. And really up until World War I, with exceptions among groups that today would be called proto-fascist, that's really what defined conservatism. That was the far right wing of the spectrum. After 1918, of course, all bets are off because of the cataclysm of World War I, because of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And so what I always tell my students is if you want to understand fascism, it emerges after World War I as a rebellion really against three things: against liberalism, against socialism, liberalism because it's blamed for the war. Most regimes in Europe in 1914 were more or less liberal regimes, even if they were monarchies. It was obviously a rebellion against and a reaction against the fear caused by the Russian Revolution in 1917. And in many respects, the people who became fascists like Mussolini or Hitler, they also despised conservatism because they believed that the old order was rotten to the core and couldn't be trusted to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, in other words, restoring order. So, this is to sort of make the point that Ernst Nolte made back in the 60s when he started talking about a fascist minimum, the idea that there are certain preconditions for fascism. And it's a negationist movement that very much is opposed to those three movements. Although, as I'm sort of exploring in a new book project, liberals would emphasize the anti-liberal parts of fascism. Marxists would emphasize the anti-left-wing sections, and it holds true for conservatives as well. It isn't really appropriate, I think, to limit it to one thing that fascists oppose. They oppose a whole bunch of things. And Juan Linz famously said that it was a latecomer on the political stage of the West, and therefore it had to kind of pick and choose eclectically from the various principles that it embraced. But if you wanted to approach it from that perspective, I would always begin by saying fascism emerged in European/Western history as a movement that expressed the absolute alienation and despondency of Europeans after World War I, basically taking a politically nihilistic approach to all the reigning ideologies, tried to come up with something that would represent a way of recovering from that trauma. And the things that they used to cobble together were essentially a very virulent form of nationalism that put the country first. In the context of Germany, of course, there was a very blatant tradition of racism and anti-Semitism that was encoded within that nationalism, much less so in Italy originally. Certainly, there was the desire to streamline the process of decision making by giving all the power to one person. So authoritarianism is a hallmark of fascism, but we should obviously be careful to note that one-man rule is hardly unique to fascism. It exists in monarchy, in monarchism, and any number of other, forms of government that are elitist as opposed to populist. And that, I guess, brings us to the last part of fascism that's unique, is that it really does seek to mobilize the masses on behalf of this new goal, or
Mm.
this new set of goals, as opposed to scorning the masses and scorning having them being involved in politics, like most traditional conservatives from the aristocracy believed. Fascists mobilize them. And so this combination of nationalism, mass mobilization, the racism and anti-Semitism, the anti-socialism, anti-liberalism, anti-conservatism, and last but not least, and maybe this is the critical difference between fascism and all other forms of right-wing thought, is that it embraces and glorifies violence. And that's a
Mm.
byproduct of the war experience, where millions of Europeans came back from the war traumatized by, the experiences they had in the trenches, and they thought that violence was a way of problem solving. And when you see how fascists behave in the 20s and 30s, violence is the means to get to the end.
I've asked this question of many people, and I think you provided the best answer. There are lots that I can get from that answer when I'm arguing with my friends, if whether a given politician is a fascist or not. Um,
Oh, and by the way, and it's just
yeah,
always, I feel like everyone should understand that fascism, like any political ideology, is relational. It can only be defined. I mean, I'm borrowing from Derrida, I guess, right? In
yeah,
supplementarity, you
yeah.
can only understand truth by understanding falsehood, and love by understanding, hey, you can't understand fascism without contrasting it to all these other movements, and of course, populism and other forms in American context, nativism, and
Mm,
there you go. So it's always
yeah,
relational.
absolutely right. Um, Speaking of America, it's kind of challenging to historicize, let's say, this phenomenon of fascism or when it started in America. And America did play a huge, huge role during the Second World War in defeating fascism. And I think I remember I saw a video on YouTube a long time ago, which is an educational video how to identify a fascist. Or I, I think it was produced by a government organization. I don't remember what. So there was this guy there was this guy speaking against migrants, and there was this European migrant in America after the war, and I said, I know what this kind of talk can do, and I start speaking with people about telling his story, which I really love that video. So
Mm-hmm.
when did, let's say, signs or symptoms of fascism begin to surface in American culture and politics? And also, it would be great in you do discuss some of the challenges associated with specifying or historicizing the rise of fascism in America. It would be good if we could discuss that as well.
Right. I mean, the problem, of course, is that when you look for the referent in real life and the
Mm,
political landscape, you need signifiers to describe those referents. And, sorry to sound all semiotic, but the point is that a lot of times people use the signifier fascism to describe things that in other contexts or from other people's perspectives wouldn't be thought of as fascist at all. So, for example, one of the anachronisms. There are a lot of historical fallacies that exist in the historiography of American fascism. I'm sort of plowing through them right now. One of them is the claim by many people that the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s was fascist before fascism even was established
mm,
in an American setting, or maybe even that the first Klan in the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War was fascist. You see the black press in the 1920s and 30s saying things to that effect. You also, for that matter, have people when they're trying to appeal to American liberal patriotic sensibilities, saying that when George Washington was rebelling against the British in 1776, he was rebelling against fascism. And there are references to fascism in the Middle Ages, and you see at a certain point that people will use it discursively, fascism
mm,
as a term, to describe whatever it is that they want to describe, or at least to dismiss or to stigmatize. And so, just because somebody says something is fascist is not, necessarily a sign of credibility. One has to see what the agendas are behind the people claiming something is fascist. So I think, like, the more today we're self-reflexive about the utility of fascism as a term, and the perspective that many people who are self-proclaimed analysts of fascism, the perspective that they're bringing to the table, that's already a precondition for having a sensible
mm,
discussion, because there are inflationary uses of the term fascism, that unfortunately end up creating what I would call the fascism analogy paradox, where the more you invoke it to describe the present, the more people tune out because it ends up being about, crying wolf functionally.
Mm,
And the book that I'm currently working on, it's called A Century of American Fascism Between Rhetoric and Reality. I guess that's the working title. It basically traces the whole discussion that American critics, journalists, politicians, activists, and so forth have had in the past century as a way of making clear that the debate about Trump since 2015 is hardly anything new, but that the arguments that are being used now to describe Trump are also anything but new. They date back really to the 20s and 30s. So to historicize the discourse about fascism is one important way of being able to say anything sensible about fascism, which is not to say that you can't find already in the period after 1933 American political movements and fringe organizations claiming that they're fascist, claiming to be inspired by Hitler and Mussolini. And, they all have names. There's the Christian mobilizers of Joe McWilliams, who was nicknamed Joe McNazi by his opponents. There's the Christian Front, led by, one would argue, Father Coughlin. You've got
mm,
the German American Bund, which was a nakedly pro-Nazi organization. You've got the Silver Shirts of William Dudley Pelley. It goes on and on and on. So really, historically, the first time you see fascism is in the 30s under Roosevelt and during the crisis of the Great Depression. But you do see people at that same time saying this is nothing new. We've had fascism for centuries.
mm, mm. Um, the, in America, I guess there was also a clearly defined fascist group, right? Before in 1930s, was there? Because I've seen again images of fascist rallies in New York. That was in 1930s during the rise of Hitler in Europe. Were
For
they
sure.
a kind of consolidated, coordinated group?
Well, I mean, there's a difference between what we call native fascist groups and foreign
Mm,
fascist groups. So already there were in the 1920s groups sponsored by the Italian fascist government, the Fascisti, with the North American Fascisti that were trying to create, offshore versions of what existed in Italy itself. But it's interesting. I came across some journal articles where representatives of the Ku Klux Klan basically said these American fascists are un-American. We have to expel them because these Italians or Italian Americans on American soil were not behaving like true red-blooded Americans. They were being more
mm,
loyal to Italy than they were to the U.S. And not to mention the fact that the Klan was a Protestant organization that was very anti-Catholic, so that fed into it. But if the Klan was opposed to the fascist movement, and if in the 30s many fascists in fact said that they opposed fascism as a foreign import, but were nevertheless making some of the same arguments, a lot of historians get around that by saying, well, the Klan was functionally fascist. Well, can you be fascist if you forswear the term fascism? And there were many people in the 30s who said if there were one day an American fascist movement, it would be people claiming that they subscribed to the Stars and Stripes and apple pie and all kinds of patriotic
mm,
symbols, but they weren't fascist at all. That would at least be their self-representation. And for that matter, it's the same with the virulent anti-Semites who claim that they don't hate Jews as Jews, they only hate Jews because they're Bolsheviks, or they hate Jews because they're capitalists. It's never the case that they want to go on the record being that nakedly racist, or in
mm,
this case, anti-Semitic. And there's a lot of bad faith arguments that circulate, but you're absolutely right. There were mass demonstrations in Madison Square Garden, in public parks in Los Angeles, where fascists would dress up in uniform. Specifically, the German American Bund would, as with the silver shirts, and they would say all kinds of things in praise of Hitler and against racial and religious minorities, and it was a pretty ugly affair all in all.
mm. Um, the, the current day politicians in the United States, I'm speaking about some Republican member of parliaments, they are some of the things they say are clearly they incite violence, anti-Semitic, it's xenophobic, it's against migrants. And again, I've been reading a lot about that. So some historians wouldn't clearly call them fascist because it's an easy term to use anyway. But you're also a historian. I'd like to ask you this question. Do you consider, for example, some of Trump or some of his supporters and the kind of rhetoric they use to be fascist?
Yeah, I mean, the question boils down to is Trump a sign of continuity in American history or a
Mm,
radical rupture? And there's, the jury's still out. There are historians, very reputable historians, who say both. They come down on one side saying he's an extension of prior American practice, so he's nothing new. That's sort of the more far left position. And then there are others who say, no, he is a rupture. He is something new. We ought to be very afraid. Liberals and conservatives would be more likely, never Trump conservatives anyway, to say that kind of thing. But if we just look at on the face of it, obviously there's plenty of precedents in American history for immigrants being expelled or immigrants being kept out of the country, whether the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which drastically reduced quotas for immigrants based on race. The fact of the matter is Mexican Americans were deported under pretty much every president after World War II, Truman, Eisenhower. We know it's happening, under Trump. It's also happened under Obama. You've had the internment of Japanese Americans, which certainly would qualify as fascist to some degree. You've got the suspension of civil liberties by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, the Alien and Sedition Act in 1798, the use of the military to break up demonstrations during the Bonus Army marches during the Great Depression. I mean, if you think that those things are violent and anti-democratic, you'd be right. But none of the regimes that did those things were fascist. So I guess it raises the question of whether there is a certain kind of violence built into liberal democracy, when liberal democracy can get very close to the edge of fascism, but of course never goes over the edge. And what would prevent it from going over the edge is such basic things as, keeping a multi-party system in existence, not banning the political opposition, not jailing your opponents under flimsy pretexts, or canceling all elections, or suspending the Constitution. So there's a continuum here. I don't think it's really so easy to say this is fascist. Look at the 12 things on the list. That's not fascist because it only has 11. But I do think that, to turn to Trump for a second, there certainly are people who are, I would call, committed fascists who are part of his coalition. Some of them are currently in jail. The people who were storming the Capitol on January 6th, who were the leaders of the Oath Keepers like Stuart Rhodes, who were the leaders of the Proud Boys like Enrico Tarrio. They were certainly militant, paramilitary, right-wing extremists who wanted to use violence. There are some people who are not in prison, but are even worse because they're self-avowed Nazis like Nick Fuentes and his kind of Groyper movement. And Trump had dinner with him at Mar-a-Lago and Kanye West. So, that's worrisome. The question is are the people who are giving Trump's campaign millions and millions and millions of dollars, are they fascists? So, people today talk about Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance, his former employee in his sort of hedge fund universe. You've got Miriam Adelson, huge billionaire. You've got all kinds of other people like the Heritage Foundation who would love to bring forth a Christian nationalist vision of America, where the line between church and state is going to be erased. But then again, that's not fascist. Church and state being interspersed with one another, that's a symbol of the old regime. Certainly in 17th century France under Louis XIV, you have that same kind of church and state fusion. And of course, if you actually look at the role of the Catholic and Protestant Church in Nazi Germany, it was totally subordinated to the German government, which was, needless to say, fascist. So there are plenty of worrisome ingredients in our present day political landscape. The most worrisome for me is the fact that the Democratic Party doesn't seem to have a viable candidate that they can unite behind. I sort of have to have faith that they will unite behind that candidate in the next 4 months. But it's a mess at the moment. And it's a function of the fact that the Democratic coalition is just so massive. The Republican coalition has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking to a hardcore base over the last several decades. And, the Democrats are an unwieldy tent full of people who are, it's multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-religious, multi-economic. It's got leftists, progressives, centrists. It's hard to keep that together. And I think that's the reason why they kept with Biden for so long, is he was seen as the best person to keep the coalition together. But if what we seem to be seeing has been going on for months, I think we've been, some of what has been going on has been hidden from the country and the Democratic electorate specifically.
I think at the beginning of the interview, you did mention that fascism, the fascists could be against liberalism socialists, communists, even conservatives, which might be a little bit surprising to people. But a lot of conservatives didn't like to be conservatives. I think even Milton Friedman hated the term conservative.
Mhm.
What is the distinction? Is that true that some conservatives are fascist? Is there some relationship between conservatism and fascism?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the historic relationship, both in Italy and Germany in the 20s and 30s, was that conservatives are the midwives of fascism. The conservatives are the ones who bring fascists into, let's say, a governing coalition because the conservatives are too weak, on their own to get the support of the masses. That was certainly true of the German Conservative Party, which was led by the Prussian Junker class of old landed aristocrats who were, barely able to pull 2, 3, 4% from the German electorate, and were totally hostile to liberal democracy and wanted to restore the monarchy. They thought that by bringing Hitler into power, they could use him as a puppet, just like Italian conservatives thought they could use Mussolini, just like maybe people in the Heritage Foundation believe they can use Trump and he'll be their pawn. The fact of the matter is, though, is that certainly in Germany and in Italy, less so in Italy, more so in Germany, the Nazis turned the tables, the fascists turned the tables on the midwives and basically took over the state altogether and shunted the conservatives aside, which is why when you actually get to July of 1944, most of the people who try and assassinate Hitler are conservatives because they have second thoughts about having jumped into bed with him. So it's an uneasy relationship. There's certainly points that they sympathize with. The usual argument, again, in the German context, is that both the conservatives in Germany, in Weimar Germany, and the Nazis, they despised um, liberal democracy in the Weimar Republic, and they both wanted to collaborate to bring it down. But once it was down, they had a very, very different set of visions for what should replace it.
Mm.
And the Nazis wanted something radical, a racial utopia, global war, and expansion and genocide is what it ended up becoming. And most conservatives would have wanted something much more measured, and were, driven to, in certain cases, try and assassinate Hitler because they realized he was dragging the country down the toilet.
Mm. You have an article in this collection of essays, and I studied literature and cultural studies, and I must say that was my favorite one. Fascism in
Okay.
American Culture, How Alternate a History. Can you talk about your article, your case studies? You talk about TV series in your chapter. Um, can you talk about that, please? The scope of your study, your essay in there?
Right. So, I mean, this is a journal. I'm sorry, this is a edited volume that has most of the essays dealing with hardcore politics. There are only several that are dealing more with cultural artifacts or cultural discourse. I happen to have as one of my side interests an interest in the field of counterfactual history and alternate history, which is the study of how history might have been different. And it turns out there's a 3,000-year tradition of historians in the West and writers wondering what if and extrapolating from what happened and imagining what might have happened. I'll spare you all the backstory, but it goes really back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. Fact of the matter is, if you fast forward though to the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries, you have kind of an explosion of alternate histories, which is to say literary explorations of how history might have been different. And the all-time most popular topic is, of course, that of the Third Reich, the Nazi period. So you've got hundreds of texts about the Nazis winning World War II. You've got texts about the South winning the Civil War, of Lenin never making it into Russia from Switzerland, and how does history turn out differently? It's a great way to examine how societies fantasize about how their own historical realities could have been different, and those fantasies and the nightmares that go along with them in many cases are very telling. So I think just as a matter of methodology, looking at counterfactual history is a great way of understanding historical memory and how people understand the way history really turned out. In any case, starting in the 2000 teens under the late Obama administration and certainly under Trump, you've got four major alternate history series becoming, in the case of this medium of streaming television, huge hits. You've got The Plot Against America, which is a six-part HBO series based on Philip Roth's famous novel from 2004. The Man in the High Castle, based on Philip K. Dick's early 1960s novel. Watchmen, which won 8 Emmys, I believe, in 2019, and uh, what's the other one? The one with Al Pacino, Hunters, which
Mm.
sort of focuses on hunting Nazis in the 1970s who have infiltrated America and are trying to create a Fourth Reich. The Man in the High Castle is probably the most famous simply because it is written by the most famous science fiction writer of the 20th century, Philip K. Dick, and imagines um, America losing World War II to both the Nazis and the Japanese. The country gets partitioned, and the whole rest of the novel, and in the case of the Amazon Prime series, it explores 4 seasons of how do Americans behave under fascist rule. And it's interesting to see how early explorations of this topic in Britain, which has, of course, its own series of narratives about the British Isles being invaded in 1940 with Operation Sea
Mm.
Lion and succumbing to Nazi rule. The same happens in the US. The early narratives always portray the British and the Americans as very patriotic rebels who overthrow Nazi tyranny and restore American or British freedom. In fact, Philip K. Dick has a much more pessimistic view, one that basically says Americans would have collaborated with the Nazis. Some would
Mm.
have resisted. Some, however, many would have just accommodated themselves to the new right wing reality. And that was meant by Philip K. Dick to be a commentary on the United States in the 1950s. He was on the far left. Philip K. Dick was himself. He had just seen the excesses of McCarthyism. And in a way, this was a parable, Philip K. Dick's Man in the High Castle, on present day American realities. And there were other people after World War II, like Orson Welles, who produced movies that were also very convinced that America could go fascist. There's a famous film called The Stranger, I think 1946, 47. And so what I argue in this book is that the proliferation of all these alternate history series in the last 5 to 10 years make us realize that there are plenty of Americans who are concerned about our own future and are losing confidence in their ability to withstand fascism, that they're exploring this nightmare in fictional, literary, cinematic, and TV form. And the fact that
Mm.
they've all either garnered awards or millions of viewers means that these series are hitting a nerve. And I think they're both a commentary on how people are feeling these days. And of course, when you look at the reception of these uh, cultural programs and you see how conservatives despise them and liberals embrace them, you can kind of see the predictable political rivalries being played out.
Mm.
But they're all worth a watch. Any of your listeners should totally stream them. They're really diverting,
I've actually
somewhat
taken some
impressive.
notes to start watching some of them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, two weeks ago that I contacted you, there was this controversial decision by the Supreme Court to give presumptive immunity to American presidents. And then last week, you had the attempt on Trump's life and the aftermath and his rising popularity. Um, you're a historian. I know that historians hate to maybe predict the future, but
Mm-hmm.
given the political zeitgeist of America and also Europe, are you optimistic about the future in terms
But
of,
no, I'm definitely not optimistic.
very
I
straightforward?
I'm certainly very anxious and very nervous. I do think that throughout you know recent decades, when many people in America were afraid that we were on the precipice of fascism, it didn't turn out, in fact, to prove true. So in 1968, which many people view as the most comparable year to the present year, countless people were saying that Richard Nixon was going to institute a fascist autocracy in America if he were to get elected. 4 years earlier, people said the same thing about Barry Goldwater. 4 years before that, there are people, when Nixon was going up against Kennedy, and you just go down the list. There have been definitely moments of crisis. One would hope that the institutions and the traditions of checks and balances in America would prevent that from happening. Unfortunately, we are in new territory with the Supreme Court being so nakedly political, seeming to put their thumb on the scales with regard to the existing political system in favor of one of the two candidates. I do think that most of what the Republican Party is putting in their platform is deeply unpopular among most Americans. But we have this electoral college that still gives disproportionate weight to a very
Mm, mm,
small percentage of the population, relatively speaking. And that gives rise to some people saying that what we're really threatened with is not so much fascism, but reactionary minority rule. Minority rule in the case of very conservative right-wing states that would end up vetoing anything more progressive that the federal government under democratic rule would try and put forth, whether on women's bodies, on climate change. And the question really becomes at a certain point, if it's minority rule, and then you realize that fascism is about mobilizing the masses, there's a disconnect there. I guess one could say that in certain red states, you could have state level fascism within a
Mm.
federal government, a 50 state country that is not fascist at the central government level. A lot of people in the 1930s said that was the Deep South under Jim Crow, that you had one party governments where Democratic officials running for election would get 95% of the vote. Federal government had no sway. And so maybe we do have that tradition that we might be going back to. But, I do think an alarm bell would go off in many people's minds if, a J.D. Vance would try and create, which apparently is one of the things he's running on as vice president, a nationwide abortion ban. If, in Connecticut, where I live, or in New York State, the federal government would come in and try and impose that kind of a one-size-fits-all approach on basic social issues, or force everyone to recite Christian prayers in public schools, that would be a sign that we were going towards something more in a fascist direction. Whether it would be fascist like Italy and Germany in the 20s and 30s, there's no reason to think it would be, just because it's 100 years ago. And any right-wing fascist trend would have all the hallmarks of the 21st century. In which case, from my perspective, we probably just need a new term. The reason why we're using the old term is that we want to make sure people get out and vote and are alarmed and aren't complacent. And the only term that seems to drive people to be sufficiently alarmed is to invoke the worst 20th century Western right-wing extremist movement there ever was, and that's fascism. So almost for reasons of marketing, the opposition, the anti-fascist opposition, has to use that term, because anything less is going to be seen as underwhelming,
Mm.
as a galvanizing strategy.
Mm. Professor Gabriel Rosenfeld, thank you very much for your time. It was called Fascism in America, Past and Present, published by Cambridge University Press. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.